She was ignored at the wedding until the vampire king claimed her. The grand hall of the royal palace glittered with gold and crystal. Candles lined the walls, their flames dancing like tiny stars caught in the vast expanse of the ceiling. Music floated through the air, carried by a gentle string orchestra, and the laughter of nobles rang like bells. Every corner of the room shimmered with elegance. Yet among all the brilliance there was one figure, unnoticed, like a shadow lost in the light. She stood near the edge of the hall, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes tracing the movements of others. The wedding was not hers. She had been invited out of duty rather than desire, a guest whose presence mattered little. Her name whispered softly in polite greetings, yet no one truly saw her. Her gown was simple, pale as winter frost, and her hair fell in loose waves, catching the candlelight but not enough to attract attention. She was invisible, and she had long grown accustomed to it. As the bride and groom exchanged vows beneath the gilded arch, the nobles clapped and cheered. Men bowed, women curtsied, jewels gleaming under the chandelier's brilliance. The air was warm with perfume and excitement, yet she felt a chill creeping up her spine, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then she felt it, a presence unlike any other. She turned, but the hall was crowded. She could see noble faces smiling and flushed with celebration, but there, in the shadows of a high balcony, he watched. His presence was magnetic, a dark pull that made her heart skip. His eyes, deep as the night sky, seemed to see her in a way no one else ever had. The Vampire King. He was a man of myth and fear. Tales whispered in the corridor spoke of his centuries-long life, of his cruelty and power, of the curse that bound him to darkness. Yet here he stood, silent, observing her, her breath caught in her throat. She should have felt fear, but instead, there was a strange thrill, like the first spark of fire in a cold, empty room. As the music swelled, she tried to convince herself it was imagination. But when the king descended from the shadows, moving through the crowd with a grace that seemed almost unreal, she could no longer deny it. Every head turned to look at him as he passed. But when he reached her, it felt as if the world had stopped. His hand brushed hers, a touch so light it could have been mistaken for a whisper of air. But she felt it in her bones, in the quickened beat of her heart. "You," he said, his voice low and commanding, carrying an echo of centuries, "you have been overlooked. But not tonight." Her mouth opened, but no words came. She had never been called out, never been seen like this. Her life had been a series of unnoticed moments, of silent struggles and careful politeness. And now the King of Shadows, feared by all, had chosen to see her. Before she could respond, he vanished. One moment he was there, and the next, the shadow swallowed him whole. She stared at the empty space, her heart pounding, unsure if she had imagined it. Yet the warmth of his touch lingered, a silent promise that she could not forget. The wedding continued, oblivious to the encounter. She watched the bride smile, the groom beam, the nobles swirl around and dance. But all she could feel was the emptiness beside her and the sudden ache of longing. He had seen her. He had chosen her. And she did not understand why. She wandered to a balcony overlooking the palace gardens, trying to calm her racing heart. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of roses and the distant sea. Moonlight spilled across the marble floor, and she felt a strange comfort in its silver glow. Then she heard it, a soft whisper carried on the wind, faint and distant, yet unmistakable. Her name. She turned, expecting to see a servant, a noble, anyone. But the terrace was empty. Only the moon watched silently, and the shadows stretched long across the garden. And still she felt it, a presence, patient and strong, waiting just beyond her sight. Blood. Her mind raced. Could it be him again? The king she had only seen for a fleeting moment? The thought made her heart flutter and ache at once. She was drawn to him, terrified yet mesmerized by the idea of his attention. Days passed, and the memory of that single touch haunted her. She could not eat, could not sleep, for her thoughts returned endlessly to the shadowed eyes that had seen her. People spoke to her at the wedding, congratulated the bride, gossiped about dresses and jewels, yet she could hear nothing but the echo of his voice in her mind. And then, on the third night, a message arrived. Not a note, not a letter, but a single black feather, delicate and dark, placed upon her windowsill. It smelled faintly of roses and iron, and it carried with it a chill that made her shiver. She touched it carefully, fingers trembling. A small note, written in a hand that seemed older than time itself, read, "Meet me where the moon touches the garden. Do not speak. I will come to you." She knew the stories of him, of his power, his hunger, the curse that made him dangerous to all who drew near. And yet, she could not resist. Something inside her whispered that this was a moment of fate, a chance to step out of invisibility and into a world she had only dreamed of. That night, she dressed quietly in a gown of silver and blue, its fabric catching the moonlight as she slipped through the palace corridors. Her heart thudded in her chest, every step a battle between caution and yearning. The garden awaited, bathed in the pale glow of the moon, quiet except for the gentle rustle of leaves. She waited near the fountain, its water shimmering, her breath rising in small clouds in the cold night air. Minutes stretched like hours. Then from the shadows he emerged. He moved without a sound, gliding toward her with a grace that seemed more than human. His eyes locked on hers, and she felt her knees weaken.
"You came," he said, almost a whisper, yet it carried weight that pressed against her very soul.
Yes, she stammered. Her voice sounded small, fragile, even to her own ears. He studied her silently, the wind teasing the dark hair around his face. There was something tragic in his gaze, a depth of sorrow she could not name. "You are not like them," he said finally. "You are not lost to the world. You are noticed." She shivered at the word as if it were a spell. All her life she had moved through crowds without anyone seeing her, without anyone caring. And now here he was, a being of darkness and power, telling her that she mattered. A sudden gust of wind sent petals swirling around them, and for a moment the world seemed suspended, caught in a bubble of moonlight and shadow. Her pulse raced, a mixture of fear and wonder. She longed to reach out to touch him again, but hesitation held her back. He stepped closer, the air between them charged with an energy she could not name. "Do you understand?" he asked, his voice gentle now, almost tender. "You are part of something far larger than this palace, this wedding, something you cannot yet see." I don't understand," she admitted, her fingers clenching at her sides. He smiled faintly, a shadow of sadness in the curve of his lips. "Soon, you will." And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The shadow swallowed him once more, leaving her alone by the fountain, heart pounding and breath ragged. Yet she was not afraid. A strange certainty filled her, a sense that her life had changed in a single moment. She had been invisible, ignored and forgotten, but no longer. The moon hung high above, its silver light reflecting in the fountain's waters. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid beat of her heart, and whispered softly, though she was alone, "Who are you?" But she knew, deep in her soul, that he would return, that this was only the beginning. And though she did not yet understand why, a small, fierce hope flared inside her, a hope that she would not remain unnoticed any longer. In the shadows beyond the fountain, two eyes glimmered like black stars, watching, waiting. The night after the wedding was colder than she had expected. The memory of the vampire king's gaze and the brush of his hand haunted her, wrapping around her heart like a shadow she could not shake. Every corner of her room seemed too bright, too empty. Her thoughts returned again and again to the black feather, the note, the promise that he would return. The clock chimed midnight, its sound echoing in the quiet hallways of the palace. She was restless, drawn by some force she did not understand. Something inside her whispered that she must go, must follow where the unseen thread of fate led her. She slipped from her bed and quietly dressed in a cloak of deep blue, the fabric brushing against her skin like whispered secrets. The palace slept, its hallways empty except for the occasional groan of stone settling in the night. Her heart thumped with each step, equal parts fear and anticipation. She was stepping into the unknown, yet she could not resist the pull that had begun the moment he had touched her hand. The garden awaited, shrouded in silver moonlight. Mist curled along the paths like living smoke, and the scent of roses filled the air. She felt as though the world had grown silent just for her, waiting for something to arrive. Then she felt it, the presence again, stronger this time, surrounding her, almost tangible. She turned toward the shadowed arch of the garden and froze. He stood there, the vampire king, taller and darker than she remembered, moved with a grace that made the night itself seem slower, more deliberate. His eyes glimmered in the moonlight, deep pools that seemed to look into her very soul. His gaze was intense, almost unbearable, yet she could not look away. "You came," he said, voice calm and sure. But there was something more, a weight, a need behind the words that made her chest tighten. I had to," she whispered, the wind carrying her voice into the night. He studied her silently, every movement deliberate, every glance sharp yet almost tender. "Good," he said finally. "You must come with me." Where would I go?" Her voice shook, not with fear, but with uncertainty. "To a place where you will understand," he replied. His hand reached toward her, and though she hesitated, she felt a magnetic pull that made her move forward. "Do not be afraid. I will not harm you." The moment she took his hand, the world seemed to bend. The garden blurred, the mist swirling around them, and suddenly they were elsewhere. She gasped as the palace disappeared behind them. Towering trees, twisted and dark, rose around a path lined with silver light. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, alive but not hostile, as though the forest itself acknowledged the king's power. "This is your domain?" she asked, voice trembling. He nodded. "Part of it. A place beyond the eyes of men. Safe for now." She could not move her gaze from him. He was both terrifying and beautiful, a creature of darkness with the weight of centuries in his posture. And yet when he looked at her, she felt seen, truly seen, in a way no one else in her life had ever looked at her. "Why me?" she asked finally, unable to keep the question from her lips. He did not answer at first. Instead, he stepped closer, the shadows moving with him, as though drawn to his presence. "Because you are different," he said finally. "Because you are not afraid of what you do not yet understand. Because you are alive." She shivered at the words, unsure if they were a comfort or a warning. She had spent so long being ignored, living quietly, that the idea of someone choosing her, someone so powerful, felt both exhilarating and terrifying. As they walked deeper into the forest, she noticed small, subtle details. The trees leaned away as if bowing. The mist parted for their steps, and faint lights hovered among the shadows, flickering like stars trapped below the treetops. This world was alive in a way she had never imagined, and it seemed to exist only because he allowed it. They reached a clearing, and at its center stood a castle unlike any she had seen before. Its towers stretched high into the night, black stone glowing faintly under the moon, and windows shimmered with pale, otherworldly light. The air was heavy, sweet with an unknown scent, and she felt both awe and fear. "This is your home?" she asked, voice small. "And now it will be yours too." Her heart skipped. She had expected a meeting, a conversation, perhaps even a warning, but the words struck her differently. He did not speak of ownership in a cruel way. It was as if he offered her a place in a world she had never known existed, a life far beyond what she had ever dreamed. Inside the castle, the halls were lined with candles that burned without smoke, casting a warm light that seemed almost alive. Shadows danced along the walls, and she felt the air thrum with magic and power. Every step echoed, yet there was no sound beyond their movement. It was a place of quiet majesty, mysterious and enchanting, and she could feel the weight of centuries pressing against the walls. He led her to a room high in the tallest tower. The space was vast, windows stretching from floor to ceiling, and the moonlight poured in, silver and cold. A fire burned in a hearth, though it seemed to light more than warm. "Rest here," he said. "Tonight you will see what I cannot show you in the light of men." She nodded, unsure what to say. She wanted to speak, to ask 100 questions, but fear and awe kept her silent. And yet, even in her silence, she felt a strange comfort. The shadows did not threaten her here. The air did not bite. She was safe, if only because he allowed it. Hours passed in quiet tension. She could hear the wind outside, the distant call of unknown creatures, and the faint sound of the castle itself settling. But she did not sleep. Her thoughts were filled with him, his voice, his gaze, the promise in the brush of his hand. Then, without warning, he appeared in the room. She had not heard him enter yet. There he was, standing by the window, silhouetted against the moonlight. "You cannot ignore it," he said, voice soft but firm. "The bond that draws you here, that draws me to you, it is not something that can be denied." "I do not understand," she admitted, her voice small and trembling. "You will," he said. "But first you must trust me." Her heart raced. She had spent her life trusting no one, being careful, staying small. And yet something in his gaze, in the way he stood before her, demanded that she believe, and against all reason, she did. The hours slipped by, and he spoke of the curse that bound him, a darkness that had followed him for centuries. He had once sought love, only to find that the world feared him, that his desire brought pain. And now, he said, he had found someone who might change that, someone who could see him not as a monster but as a man. She listened, every word etching itself into her soul. The fear she had felt at first was replaced by curiosity, and then by something deeper, longing, a desire not just to understand him but to help him. "You could be safe here," he said finally, moving closer. "Safe, and yet not trapped. I will not force you to stay if you do not wish it. But know this, once you are here, the world outside may never accept you again." She considered his words. Safety, yes. Comfort, yes. And yet she felt the weight of her own life pressing against her. The world outside had ignored her, dismissed her, but it had been familiar. This was new, unknown, and frightening. I think I want to understand," she said softly. He nodded, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something more. Relief, almost joy, in his expression. "Then you are mine," he said. Not in possession, not in threat, but in a bond that neither fully understood yet. "And I will protect you as I should have long ago." The night stretched on, and the castle whispered around them, alive with power and shadow. And though fear lingered in her heart, it was joined by excitement, wonder, and the first spark of hope she had ever felt. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains and trees, carrying with it the scent of night and magic. Inside the tower, 2 figures stood by the window, bathed in moonlight, bound by a promise neither fully understood but both felt in the depths of their souls. And somewhere, in the shadows of the castle, eyes watched, waiting, as the night deepened and the bond between them grew stronger. The Vampire King had claimed her, not as possession, but as part of a story that would change them both forever. And she had no desire to resist. The castle was unlike anything she had ever imagined. Towering walls of black stone rose above her, windows glowing faintly in the silver moonlight. Inside, the halls twisted like living veins, lined with candles that burned without smoke. Shadows clung to the corners, moving as if aware of her presence. It was beautiful, frightening, and utterly alive. The Vampire King walked beside her, his hand brushing hers occasionally, a silent reassurance she could not name. He seemed more relaxed in his domain, yet the weight of centuries lingered in his posture. Every so often his gaze would drift to the far corners of the castle, alert and watchful, as if the walls themselves could hide danger. "You must learn the rules here," he said softly, his voice like velvet wrapped around steel. "The castle is alive. It listens. It remembers. And it will test you." She looked around nervously, her fingers clutching the edges of her cloak. "Test me? How?" He smiled faintly, a shadow of amusement mixed with caution. "In small ways. Doors may close unexpectedly. Hallways may twist. Shadows may follow. But nothing will harm you, unless you invite it to." She shivered, both from fear and the thrill of the unknown. She had lived a life of quiet obedience, of stepping back and fading away. Here, in this castle of shadows and candlelight, she felt alive in a way she had never known. Their first steps took them to a great hall, wider and taller than any room she had seen in the palace. The ceiling stretched high above, lost in darkness, and chandeliers of black crystal hung like frozen stars. The floor was polished obsidian, reflecting the faint candlelight and the two figures who walked upon it. "This is where I meet visitors," the king said. "Rarely, of course. Few dare enter my domain. Most are afraid." She followed silently, her eyes tracing the intricate patterns on the walls, the faint runes etched into the stone that glimmered as he passed by. "Why do you stay here, if all fear you?" she asked. He paused, and for a moment his expression softened. "Because this is the only place I am myself. Outside I am a legend, a curse, a name whispered with fear. Here, I am just a man who has lived too long." She hesitated, then reached out. Her fingers brushed his arm lightly, tentative, yet full of understanding. "You're not just a curse," she said softly. You're more. You're lonely." He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting both surprise and something else, a flicker of hope. "You can see that?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she whispered. I see you." For a moment, silence settled over them, broken only by the distant echo of the castle's whispers. It was as if the building itself had recognized her acknowledgement, approving the bond that had begun the night she had followed him here. Days passed, though time seemed different in the castle. She wandered through corridors that twisted impossibly, discovering gardens that bloomed with silver flowers, libraries filled with books older than kingdoms, and halls that shifted with the wind. The king was always near, watching, teaching, guiding, but never forcing. And yet she noticed a change in him. He spoke less of power, of darkness, and more of stories, of memories long buried. He told her of the centuries he had walked alone, the friends and loved ones lost to time, the regret that weighed heavier than any crown or kingdom, and she listened, heart aching, understanding the depth of his loneliness in a way that no mortal had ever managed. "You could leave," he said one evening as they sat in a small moonlit garden, the petals of black roses drifting on the wind. "The world outside is still yours. You do not have to stay." She looked at him, her hands folded in her lap, the candlelight reflecting in her eyes. I don't want to leave," she admitted. "I've spent so long being invisible." "Here, I am seen." He studied her, and for the first time a faint smile touched his lips. "Then stay, not because you must, but because you choose." She nodded, a small, fierce warmth filling her chest. She had never felt so certain of anything in her life, and yet, even in the safety of his words, a flicker of worry shadowed her mind. The outside world still existed with all its dangers, and even here, she could feel the tension of something unseen. It came sooner than she expected. A sound in the halls, distant but deliberate, echoed through the castle. Footsteps, heavy and purposeful, moving with intention. She tensed, glancing at the king, whose eyes darkened instantly. "They have found you," he said, voice low. Someone from the outside, someone who will not be ignored. Before she could speak, he was moving, fast and silent, guiding her down twisting corridors to a hidden stairway. Shadows seemed to bend and swirl around them, closing passages and opening new ones, protecting them, guiding them. The castle itself had awakened. She followed him without question, heart pounding, adrenaline sharp. She had never felt more alive, and yet fear gnawed at the edges of her courage. At the top of the stairway, they emerged into a room bathed in moonlight. The floor was polished stone, walls lined with mirrors that reflected not just their images but strange flickering visions of the past, memories of the castle and its king, moments of loss, pain, and fleeting happiness. The intruder entered, and for the first time she saw the danger clearly. A human, noble, but ambitious, someone who had been jealous of her presence at the wedding and resentful of the attention the king had given her. His eyes burned with greed and curiosity, and he stepped forward as though he owned the place. "You," the intruder said, voice sharp, "you do not belong here." She stepped back instinctively, but the king's hand brushed hers, grounding her. "Leave," he said, his voice calm but cold, carrying the weight of centuries. "You are not welcome here." The intruder laughed, a sound that was both cruel and nervous. "And who are you to say?" he demanded. "A shadow king playing with what he does not own?" The king's eyes glimmered, dark and endless. "I own nothing," he said softly, "except what is freely given. And she is here because she chose to be, not because of fear or demand." The intruder faltered, uncertainty creeping into his voice, but pride pushed him forward and he lunged, attempting to seize her. In that moment, something within her snapped. Fear, uncertainty, and years of being overlooked were replaced by determination. She pushed him back, her hands moving with surprising strength, and the intruder stumbled. The king watched, not with surprise, but with something almost like pride. She had acted, not blindly, but with courage. The intruder, realizing he could not prevail, retreated, his anger and fear mingling as he fled into the night. The castle seemed to sigh, the shadows returning to their quiet corners, the air settling once more. She sank to the floor, heart racing, hands trembling. I did it," she whispered, disbelief and exhilaration mingling in her voice. The king knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yes," he said softly, "you did. And you were never truly invisible, were you? You simply had not yet seen your own strength." Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness, but of understanding and release. For the first time, she saw herself not as someone overlooked, but as someone capable, someone seen and acknowledged in a way that mattered. He helped her to her feet, and they walked to the balcony together, overlooking the moonlit forest. The night was quiet, the stars reflected in the mist, the castle alive and protective around them. "You are not afraid of the darkness," he said finally, voice low, carrying an edge of awe. "Most would be terrified, but you face it." She looked at him, heart full, understanding the depth of his words. "Because you are here," she said softly, "and because you saw me." For a moment, they stood in silence, bound by the events of the night and the unspoken understanding between them. And though danger had passed, she knew it was only a moment of peace, a calm before the next challenge. Somewhere deep in the castle, shadows shifted and eyes glimmered. The world outside still watched, still whispered, still waited. And the bond between them, fragile yet strong, would be tested again. But for now, the heroine felt a sense of purpose and courage she had never known. She was no longer invisible. She had faced fear, embraced the unknown, and discovered strength within herself. And the Vampire King, for the first time in centuries, allowed himself to hope, not just for her, but for redemption, for a future that was no longer bound by darkness alone. As the wind whispered through the towers, carrying the scent of night and roses, they stood together on the balcony, hand in hand. The night stretched endlessly, mysterious and infinite. a world of possibilities waiting to be discovered. And in that quiet, silver-lit moment, she knew one thing for certain. The story of shadows, power, and love had only just begun. The castle lay under a sky heavy with clouds, moonlight struggling to pierce the dark veil above. A storm approached, winds rattling the tall towers, carrying the scent of rain and salt from the distant sea. It was a night of endings and beginnings, of choices that could not be undone. The heroine stood at the edge of the tallest balcony, her cloak whipping around her like liquid shadow. Below, the forest stretched endlessly, twisted trees bending in the wind. She had grown used to the castle's strange, alive energy, the shifting hallways, the whispered warnings, but tonight, even she felt its tension. Something beyond the walls stirred, a force that threatened more than the intruders of before. The vampire king appeared beside her silently, as if the night itself had carried him there. His presence was calm, yet heavy with the weight of centuries. The wind tangled his dark hair around his face, and his eyes, deeper than midnight, met hers. "They are coming," he said simply. "No fear, only certainty. And this time, it will not be as before." She swallowed hard, gripping the stone railing. "Who? What do they want?" "Those who would undo what we have begun," he said. "The curse that binds me. It is not just my own. It is old, older than any kingdom, and it will not be broken without a choice, one that can cost both of us everything." Her heart raced. She had already risked so much, had already stepped into the unknown. Yet now the weight of this night pressed upon her like a storm cloud ready to burst. "What choice?" she asked softly. He reached for her hand, the touch familiar and grounding. "The curse demands a sacrifice or a surrender. I can embrace the darkness fully and become what I was meant to be, alone, feared, immortal. Or I can choose redemption, but it requires your trust, your courage, your willingness to stand by me." She looked into his eyes, feeling the depth of his centuries, the loneliness, the longing. She realized that their bond had grown beyond fear and fascination. It had become trust, mutual, unspoken, undeniable, and she was ready. I will stand with you," she said, voice steady despite the storm around them. "Whatever it takes." He studied her face, a flicker of hope mingling with relief. "And we face it together," the castle seemed to respond. Candles flickered, shadows stretched, and the walls hummed with energy. Together they descended into the heart of the fortress, to the ancient chamber that held the center of the curse. The room was circular, walls carved with runes that pulsed faintly in the darkness. In its center lay a black stone, smooth and cold, glowing faintly as if alive. "This is where it began," the king said quietly, "and where it can end." She followed him, her heart hammering. The air was thick with power, almost tangible, pressing against her chest, yet she felt no fear, not with him near. "Do you trust me?" he asked, voice soft, almost tender. She nodded, squeezing his hand. "I trust you. Always." He lowered himself to the stone, kneeling, and she mirrored him instinctively. Shadows gathered around them, twisting, whispering, testing their resolve. The curse was alive, a force older than kingdoms, challenging them, threatening to tear apart everything they had built. "Face it," the king said. "Face the darkness with me." She took a deep breath, letting the fear and awe settle into determination. "I am not afraid," she whispered, though her voice trembled slightly. "I am here with you." Shapes formed, flickering, dark, humanoid, each one a memory of pain and sorrow, of victims and mistakes, of centuries of loneliness. The king's eyes glowed faintly as he stood, raising his hands. "You will not claim her," he said, voice booming through the chamber. "I am done running from what I am. I am done hiding in the shadows. She is mine, not as possession, but as my equal. And we will face you together." The shadows hesitated, then pressed closer, voices rising like a storm. And she, standing beside him, felt a courage she had never known. "Leave us," she said, voice strong, echoing in the chamber. "You have no power here. Not if we stand together." The darkness recoiled, faltering as if the unity of their bond was stronger than the force itself. The king turned to her, his expression both fierce and tender. "Do you feel it?" he asked. "Our strength together?" "Yes," she said, heart pounding. "We are stronger together." With a deep breath, he extended his hands toward the center of the chamber, toward the black stone. She mirrored him, placing her palms beside his. A pulse of energy shot through them, bright and blinding, the runes along the walls glowing like fire. The shadows screamed, writhing and twisting, then began to dissolve, melting like smoke in the wind. The storm outside intensified, wind lashing against the towers, thunder rolling through the mountains. Yet inside, the chamber glowed with a warm, radiant light. And as the last of the shadows vanished, the weight of centuries lifted. The king collapsed to his knees, breathing heavily. She reached for him, touching his shoulder gently. "It's over," she whispered. "You did it." He shook his head slightly, a faint smile on his lips. "No, we did it. Together." Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness, but of relief and joy. The curse that had haunted him for centuries, that had bound him in darkness and fear, was lifted, not by magic alone, but by trust, courage, and love. They remained kneeling for a long moment, hands intertwined, hearts still racing, breathing in sync. The storm outside began to fade, moonlight spilling fully across the towers, silver and soft. The castle itself seemed to breathe, shadows retreating, walls settling, alive but at peace.
"You have given me something I thought lost forever," the king said quietly.
"Redemption. And
"Hope. And you gave me a place where I belong," she replied, voice steady.
a life where I am seen, not ignored." He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face, a smile touching his lips, gentle, human, and full of warmth. "Then we have both won," he said softly. They rose together, standing on the balcony as the storm cleared. Below, the forest stretched endlessly, silvered by moonlight, calm and watchful. She leaned slightly into him, feeling the weight of centuries still present but no longer oppressive. "Do you think the world will accept us now?" she asked softly, voice tinged with worry. He shook his head, a small, amused smile playing on his lips. "No," he said, "but we will not need it. We have our own kingdom here, made of trust, courage, and us. That is enough." She smiled, feeling the peace she had never known. She had walked into a world of shadows, fear, and unknown power, and emerged not just seen, but strong, vital, alive. And he too had found something more than immortality. He had found redemption and companionship. The night stretched on, quiet and infinite. They remained on the balcony, hand in hand, hearts aligned, shadows and light dancing around them. The castle, alive and eternal, held them in its embrace. Somewhere deep within its walls, the memories of the past lingered, quiet and respectful. But no longer did they threaten. No longer did they hold power over what was to come. "You are not afraid anymore," he said softly, voice barely above a whisper. "I am afraid," she admitted, "but only of losing this moment, losing us. Nothing else matters." He pulled her close, the wind swirling around them, carrying the scent of night and roses.
"Then we will face it all," he said, "together."
Always. And in that moment, standing on the edge of a precipice where the storm and the forest met, two hearts intertwined. The darkness of centuries gave way to light. The vampire king and the woman once ignored had forged a bond stronger than fear, deeper than curses. The world outside might still whisper, might still judge, might still fear. But within the castle, in the heart of shadows and moonlight, they had found something far greater: trust, courage, and a love that could endure even the oldest darkness. And as the first light of dawn brushed the horizon, silver and gold spilling over the mountains, they knew one thing for certain. This was not an ending. It was a beginning of a life chosen, a bond tested, and a love eternal. No longer invisible, no longer afraid, they faced the world together. Shadows might linger, storms might rage, but they were ready. And together they would stand, unbroken, unafraid, and forever bound.